Welcome back to day 2 of our Smocked Mary D sew along. Today we'll finish our Mary D. So if you've got your top yoke on and your piping on the bottom of your smocking, you can now take out your pleater threads. I've got mine out, and I just wanted to say, if you cut your knots off of your pleater threads and pull, if there have been places where you possibly caught your thread with as you're smocking, you don't want to just keep tugging and tugging, but if you'll take the eye of a needle and then just reach in wherever you see the thread and pull it and clip it that way, and then you may have to do that several times, but that's much better than just pulling. And if you use the eye of the needle, you're less likely to snag your fabric or your floss from your smocking. So get that done. And if you haven't cut everything else out, go ahead and get everything else cut out, and we will get our skirts on our bodices. See you in a little bit. Now it's time to stitch in your gathering threads, and this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so stitch one about 3/8 of an inch from the top and one about 5/8 of an inch from the top, so that you can still be stitching in between those two gathering threads. Before you start gathering though, mark the center front of your front skirt, and then also mark the center front of your bodice. Then you will be gathering and pinning, and as you do that, just line up the edge of your fabric with the edge of the piping and the smocked insertion. And instead of using your piping foot, you're not going to be able to feel a ridge to put in any kind of groove. But what I will use is an open toe foot. That way I can see that contrasting line that I stitched when I stitched my piping on. So if you remember to do that, you've got a nice line that you're just going to stitch right on top of. And if you use something that gives you more visibility, a clear plastic foot or an open toe foot, then you will probably stitch right on the line. So get that done, and we will be ready to get our back skirts ready. Okay, now that you've gotten your skirt sewn on, always check before you trim to make sure you didn't catch anything that you didn't want to catch. And then after you do that, you'll need to trim and finish this seam allowance. I've finished it with my serger, but you could also just do a simple zigzag. Once you've done that, normally if this wasn't a smocked insertion, you'd be pressing that seam allowance up, but that seam allowance isn't going anywhere, so it's going to lay down. And when in a little while, when we put our lining, our front lining on, it will actually hang loose along there instead of being stitched down. That way you don't have any pulling happening with the front yoke. Okay, now we are ready to do our back skirts. So the first thing I want you to do is press under 1/4 of an inch and stitch that down, and then press an inch, and that forms your facing for your back skirts, because remember, they are open, they overlap, but they are open, so we need to finish them. And then do the same thing with your other skirt. If you have a fabric that has a direction, you need to be sure that you are doing a left and a right back skirt. Let's see. After you get that done, go ahead and put your gathering threads in your back skirts just like you did your fronts, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you are to pin your back skirts onto your back bodice. Now you should have your back skirts gathered, and when you pin the back bodice to the back skirts, be sure that you leave 1/4 of an inch of the bodice extending beyond the fold of the facing. So it will look like this on the front. I realize it's kind of hard to tell since my fabrics are the same. But it's going to look like this. So your side seams, they will match. But over here, your bodice will extend 1/4 of an inch, and that's to allow us to stitch the lining on in just a little bit. So I want you to do a 1/2 inch seam, and then trim to 1/4 of an inch and press that seam up toward the bodice. Once you do that with both your fronts, we will be ready to do our shoulder seams and get our lining on. Now we're ready for shoulder seams. With right sides together, stitch the back shoulders to the front of the dress, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and press those seams open. And then you're going to press the bottom edge of your linings, both backs and the front, and then also do the shoulder seams of the lining. Same way, 1/4 of an inch, and press those seams open. And we'll be right back. Now that you've got your shoulder seams done, place your lining on your dress, matching armholes, neck edges, shoulder seams. At the bottom here, you need to match here. And then I've already sewn mine and started trimming some. When you stitch the lining to the dress, leave the lining folded. And then you're going to stitch up that 1/4 inch that you left extended there, and then around the neck, back down, and then each armhole. After you've done that, you'll need to trim and clip. And then I was going to show you how you turn the back of the dress through the shoulder seam. Once you get it started, it goes pretty easily. Now, so after you have got your dress back, turned right side out, you'll need to use your point turner and just kind of poke out the corners there at the back. And then you'll be pressing, which is got one side turn, so it's kind of awkward. Then you will press all of your edges so that you have a nice, even sewn edge at the armhole and at the neckline. So you get that done, and then we will be back for the next step. Okay, now that you have your lining stitched and turned right side out and everything pressed, before we leave step 3, I just wanted to go over this last sentence with you. It says, if needed, for views A and B, whip stitch the armhole seam allowance of the smocked fabric to the back of the smocking to prevent it from adding bulk and the lining rolling forward. That really should say, you will need. Let me show you why. This is what it does if you don't whip stitch that seam allowance of the smocked insertion down. You will, and I've used some red fabric marker here so that you can see a little better. But you can see how that just rolls to the front, because that's where the seam allowance is, and it's, you know, it's just very bulky, and it's always going to want to flip out that way. So what we're saying to do is to whip stitch it down. I used green thread hoping that you could see a little better, but I just took a little stitch into the back of the insertion, into the pleats, and then a stitch into the seam allowance. And I tugged pretty hard, so you definitely want to use a polyester thread. And I just did a whip stitch all along here, the entire armhole part of the smocked insertion. So this goes for view A as well. If it was just the smocked skirt, you would still be dealing with this. So this is what you do to remedy that. So once that is whip stitched down, then you can see the difference. You can see, I've let go. If I hadn't whip stitched that down, it would be flipping up just like it did on the other side. So this is a good time to do that. You can do it after the side seam, but it's just easier to do it right now. But if you have a highlighter or something to just draw attention to that sentence, it's probably a good thing to do, or you may forget to do that the next time you make a Mary D. Don't those armholes look nice? The next thing we're going to do is the side seam. So we'll be matching the armholes. It's a lot of thickness right there to pin through. And then, so you will start at the bottom edge of the lining, the front and back lining, and you will stitch all the way down to the bottom, and then finish that seam and do the other seam. When you stitch with the smocked side up, the back of the smocked insertion, because you need to stitch right there, right at the first, right beside that first pleat. That needs to be nice and straight right there. So, but on both sides, stitch with that side up. Okay? We'll be right back. Okay, we're almost finished. The instructions say to press your lining up 1/2 inch and straight stitch along near the fold, about 1/8 inch from the fold, and then let the lining be loose, just tacking it at the side seams and at the center front. But this is just personal preference, and I like to just go ahead and whip it down in the back and then keep the front loose. But now it's confession time. So when I first planned this project, I planned on making it 18 months. So that's how many rows I needed for an 18-month was 8 rows smocked, 10 rows pleated, which I did. And then when I went to print my pattern, I decided to make a 12-month. Actually, I didn't remember that I was going to make an 18-month. But anyway, I cut out a 12-month. So I blocked my insertion for a 12-month and did all of my other pattern pieces for a 12-month. And then a few minutes ago, I realized I smocked 8 rows when a 12-month is only supposed to be 7 rows. So everything has pretty much worked out, except that I don't want to fold my front lining up 1/2 inch because I like it to cover the insertion seam. So I just serged the edge and I will tack it down at the sides and whip stitch across the front. No one will ever know, except y'all. So that's my confession for today. I'm sure there'll be another one next week. So get your lining whipped down in the back if you choose to do that. And I like to go ahead and do that before I do the buttonholes. And so I'm going to be doing my buttonholes. And yes, I forgot to mark them, so I've got to get my pattern back out. Remember that your dress, the buttonholes go on the right, buttons on the left. And go ahead, when you're marking buttonholes, go ahead and put the marks here too, because your buttons will go in that same spot. And then I will see you back in just a few minutes. Well, I hope you've enjoyed 2 weeks of Mary D's. Very sweet. Just as cute in the back. Gotta love a Mary D. See you next week.